Okay, we're gonna give it a few minutes as everybody comes into the room here.
Well, I'll do one of my famous icebreaker questions, so it's not just dead silence, but for Justin and Bonnie, what's the coldest you've ever been? Where have you been, like freezing cold? As soon as I say that, usually a memory pops up, but Bonnie or Justin?
As soon as you said that, a memory popped up. But Justin, I don't know if you want to go first.
I'm still trying to think of like the actual coldest I've ever been. So you might need to go. Give me a second.
For me, I did a run fairly recently where it was 31 degrees. And so that's actually that's kind of nice for running conditions, but the standing outside for like the hour and a half plus before the run, I remember the first 3 miles of the run, I literally could not feel my feet. So I kept looking down to think like, are my feet still there? Yeah, they're still there. Oh, yep, they're still there. So again, it was nice once I got going after about mile 3, but the first 3 miles, I literally felt like I had no feet.
I love that. It's a good one.
Yeah. I do remember Johnny was telling this story the other day, a few years ago, it might've been 2020. A friend of mine hosts an event riding up Mount Evans, which is a 14er in Colorado. And it was a beautiful day. It was 4th of July. It was a beautiful day until we got to the top and turned around, and there was a huge black cloud that dumped inches of hail on us. There was lightning below us. And, yeah, descending in that, just hoping your hands actually know how to brake. And I think I was shaking and cramping for a couple hours after that. It was pretty bad.
We definitely had hypothermia. I mean, we came around a corner and there was this much hail in the road, and our tires was about this thick. And there was no railing, right? There was no guardrails to talk income laptop, right?
So I think I just learned something new. That was a good icebreaker. Are you guys both road riders?
I'll ride anything, Bonnie. Good to meet you, by the way. I'll ride mountain. Actually, the big thing I'm into right now is gravel. Really like that.
I do less than I used to. I do a lot more mountain biking now. I got hit by a car a couple of years ago, and that definitely put me off it a bit. But so it looks like we still got a few people kind of.
Well, I'll finish my story.
All right, let's hear Jamie's answer.
It feels like I'm in therapy here. So what is the coldest?
We had a couple of minutes to let people come in, so I did one of my. I like different icebreakers. The coldest you've ever been is always a fun one because we learned about biking, we learned about Bonnie running. Mine, when I was actually traveling to Chicago, and I had the first time I ever been to Chicago. I didn't have a winter coat, I didn't have gloves, and I had to carry these boxes of books for the American College. So we would travel, and the American College does not make a lot of money. It's a nonprofit, so you would carry the binders with you on the plane sometime. And so I would have like this 50 binders in a box, and was carrying it through Chicago after I got off the train. And I kept going in different stores because my hands were getting so cold and like hurting. And so I'd like stand inside something and then go 3 more blocks and stand inside. And that's the coldest I've ever been, was on that trip to Chicago.
I mean, for me, bar none, it would have to be in my military time in Denmark. I just remember sometimes literally not knowing if my feet were still attached, like just in the winter, sleeping outside for weeks, and like, I can't feel my feet. I don't know if I can walk, like that sort of thing. But the hail thing was quite the experience.
All right, we'll get going. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Jamie, I'm definitely going to take the icebreaker idea for the future, for that awkward period where everyone's coming in. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us, and definitely want a big thank you to our panelists for today. Jamie Hopkins from Carson Group, Bonnie Treichel from or did I pronounce your last name wrong there? Probably did. Retirement. Did I get it right? Awesome. And Johnny Paulson from Income Lab. Unlike some other product launch webinars we've done in the past, we decided to do this one a little bit differently. So thus the panel. So I will set it up with kind of a quick review, kind of 30,000-foot view of what we're up to here, and then I'll do a quick kind of demo of the new feature, the retirement stress test, and then we'll have a discussion, especially focused on kind of client experience, advisor experience, psychology around retirement planning, and try to weave in some of the themes that relate to the new retirement stress test, and really talk about stress testing in kind of practical terms, what it means to people in their lives. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And before getting into the stress test itself, I actually want to back up for those who maybe aren't as familiar with Income Lab or with adjustment-based planning or retirement income management in general, and just kind of set the stage. So Income Lab is retirement income management software. And those words are carefully chosen. It's for people kind of at and in retirement, for advisors to provide them with guidance. So I think probably one of the best analogies that I've heard for this is, imagine you're driving down the road and your GPS, instead of giving you turn-by-turn directions, just says you have a 70% chance of reaching your destination in time. Well, that might be true, but it's not very helpful. It's what you need at that point is directions. And so Income Lab is all about helping advisors give directions. What can I spend? What would cause me to change that? And what would the size of those changes be? So that's what you see here. This is kind of this main dashboard for a plan. This, the plan already knows all about the household's financial resources, whether those are investments, Social Security, pensions, anything that can fund their lifestyle. And it's answering the question, what can I spend per month? And then, they have about $2.25 million in a portfolio, and it's saying, we're not going to drive this thing off a cliff, Wile E. Coyote style. We're going to adjust. If things get better than expected, we'll be able to spend more. If things get, worse than expected, we will have to spend less. Answering that question of what can I spend given my resources, there's not really one answer to that. There's a range of answers that could work for people, and it really depends on their preferences. So this is showing you, okay, given these folks resources, kind of a range, and you can see down here basically bookends, reasonable bookends on how much they can spend. So way down here on the more conservative side, lower spending, lower chance of adjustment, $13,600 a month. Up here on the higher end, $15,200 a month. So, a pretty good range, especially if you annualize that. And you can see I can spend more, but it takes less of a loss in my portfolio to have an adjustment. So I've got to be more willing to take adjustments if I'm spending more. If I'm spending less, I have a bigger buffer here, right? And that trade-off is something that clients tend to really understand, right? They get it, that, yeah, I can spend more as long as, I'm willing to tighten my belt if I have to. So the stress test that we're launching is really meant to address the next level of this. And I would say it kind of rhymes with the effect that even just seeing these basic guardrails have. So when you show a client that they're not going to fail in retirement, generally we see the stress level come way down. When you say, hey, people don't fail in retirement, they adjust. That's a big deal. But showing them actual dollar amounts for what those adjustments would be is maybe an even bigger deal. Because if you just say, hey, we're going to adjust, well, you kind of let people's imagination go wild, and they might imagine it's a 40 or 50% adjustment if the global financial crisis happens again. So people will often say, all right, this looks good, like I can live with this plan, but what does a longer term experience look like? And when they ask that, they don't mean if things go really well. I mean, that, if things go well, things are going to be good. What they mean is, what if we get hit with some bad times, right? So that's what this stress test is about. So the new retirement stress test is a way to hit your plan with a bunch of actual historical experiences, hopefully memorable ones in certain cases, and see how that adjustment plan, how that retirement GPS would have guided you through these periods. To see, is this the kind of plan you can handle as a client or even as an advisor? Or, does it need to be more conservative? Or if maybe it's too conservative, maybe there's not enough kind of flexibility built into the plan because they're being so conservative. So along the top here, you'll see 5 historical periods. You have the global financial crisis, the dot-com bubble, the stagflation era, post-war decade, and the Great Depression. And what we do is we'll launch the plan either before, during, or after each of these kind of big events, and see how it would have adjusted over time. See how the guardrails and things would have worked out. So an example is, and this is a very simple plan. This is we don't even have the retirement smile built in here. Just 2 Social Securities and portfolio withdrawals. But you can see as time goes on from 2008 to 2009, in February of 2009, this plan gets a pay cut. They were hoping to be able to spend $12,700, but starting in February of 2009, they had to pull back, in this case by $400 a month. That belt tightening lasted until December of 2014, when they got to pop up. In fact, in this case, their pay raise took them above their planned level, and they've never looked back. If you're interested in why this was going on, well, down here you can see the portfolio balance moving toward that lower guardrail. So keep in mind those green and red lines we saw earlier. And then we're in the no change range in the clear here until December 14, right? So you can kind of see, if you were a client living through this period and you were checking your plan, you were getting an update from your advisor, you would have been seeing, in this case, your portfolio balance approaching the lower guardrail. Then it would have stuck toward the top. And then 2022 came along, and it is now bouncing around really close to getting a pay cut. Right? Not there yet, but we are darn close. Okay, so a couple of things that you can use this for as an advisor. One is what I just said, which is providing clarity and specifics on how adjustment-based planning really works. So not allowing people to just imagine, the worst possible things in the world, really saying, okay, how does this methodology of giving you adjustment advice really work in real situations? And allowing people to say, can I live with that? Another is you can really subject it to different stresses. So we all remember the global financial crisis, and certainly returns were not good, but there wasn't a lot of inflation, actually. I think inflation maybe hit 5%, but it was actually deflation in some months thereafter. But you could say, well, let's look at stagflation. Now we have a lot of inflation from 1968 through through the 80s, certainly. And you can see, okay, this plan actually suffered more from inflation than it did from the global financial crisis. So here, these folks were, having to pull back a lot more substantially for a shorter amount of time, but more substantially in their spending. You might be interested in, kind of a deep economic contraction. Far more than we saw in the global financial crisis, and to see how a plan would have reacted to that. Often people are actually a little surprised by the Great Depression. I think the reason is that kind of balanced portfolios and things did better than you might think, mostly because there was a lot of deflation. So your purchasing power actually held up okay, even though you saw portfolio balances really suffering. Another way that you can use this as an advisor, other than painting this picture for clients, and I don't want to minimize the value of that. That is probably the number one value, but you can use it to evaluate plans yourself and say, is this the kind of plan I think that these clients really could live with? Are these the types of adjustments they can handle? So, for example, if let's go to stagflation again. All right, so this is a pretty decent, amount of belt tightening for several years. I might have clients who really don't want bad news, and they're willing to spend less now in order to kind of protect themselves more from downturns. So they'll tighten their belt today in order not to have bad news. And so I just pulled back. Remember those bookends? I just pulled that slider over to the more conservative side, and now I don't have any pay cuts during stagflation. Now there's a cost to that. I have to spend less, but maybe they live fairly frugal lives. Another thing you can do is test how different allocations work during different periods. So, for example, in the global financial crisis, if I add a lot more equity, I go to a 90% equity portfolio. Now I actually have a pay cut back in November, and then a couple more, and now I'm down quite a bit less. When before it was $400. Now I'm these are quite meaningful cuts. On the other hand, go to the other side, a very low equity allocation, and again, maybe not surprising, but wouldn't have needed a pay cut at all during the financial crisis. Would have also been right. You can see what the experience would have been here. Much smoother ride. They would have also had to spend less though, because an all bond portfolio supports a lot less income in general. So those are a couple different ways to use this, primarily for really helping people understand long-term experiences, realistic experiences when you kind of have the GPS turned on, and then to kind of test different plan options and maybe even run those by the client. Something like, which would you prefer, to spend more but have to take this kind of pay cut, or be more conservative and reduce the chances that you get a call from me, your advisor, telling you that it's time to find a place to trim back. So with that, and we can definitely refer back to the stress test again. I think I'll kind of set up our panel. I think it's important to note that this is not the first retirement stress test. It's certainly not the first stress test of any sort in the world. We given bank failures and things, I think we hear about stress tests a lot. You certainly have seen portfolio stress tests that I think are really helpful in the market, but you've even seen retirement stress tests before. What's different here is we're not just kind of hitting a portfolio with a downturn and then saying, how did my probability of success change? The answer to that question is always, well, it gets worse, right? I mean, that's, of course, that's just what it does. But I think if we think about client experiences when they see that kind of a stress test, it just says, hey, if the global financial crisis happened, your 90% probability of success would go to 55. If we think about the effect that has on people, it can't help but raise anxiety, right? That just seems to be the main goal of a stress test like that. But I would say I'm not sure that should be our goal as advisors, as financial professionals. Certainly clients probably don't have that goal. So that what we've tried to do here is provide something that actually can, tell the truth about how these experiences work in a way that can raise client confidence. So it's sort of a little bit of a different approach to retirement stress testing. And I think from that, I'd like to start asking our panel about client stress, client anxiety, or really just retiree stress and anxiety, and ask kind of what, in your experience, what things in the retirement planning process tend to lead to stress and anxiety. What role do emotions play in people's ability to make, financial decisions like whether to retire, how much to spend, and so on. Bonnie, maybe we'll start with you. I know you work in the retirement plan world, so I think your point of view on this is really interesting. I'm sure there are thousands and thousands of plan participants who have been through this kind of emotional situation. So what would you say in your experience leads to stress and anxiety?
Yeah, well, Justin, thanks so much for having me on, and really love to see what you're doing here. I think, as you mentioned, I might approach this a little bit differently than the other panelists on the call, because I approach it from the perspective of the plan side. So I work mostly with plan sponsors or employers, with retirement plan advisors, and then with the participant side of things. But I think to your question of kind of what causes stress or anxiety, it's interesting to me that it's all about the uncertainty, and it's in kind of two respects, right? It's looking at how we have participants who they don't retire or they don't leave work because they don't realize that they can. So just by not having the tools and resources to realize, hey, I actually can retire, that has the negative impact on their employer of having to, incur additional costs from folks who don't retire when they should. And then likewise, we end up with some folks who actually do go ahead and retire because maybe they have to for health reasons or otherwise. But again, they retire and then they have that fear of outliving their savings, or they end up outliving their savings because of the longevity issues. And I think it's pretty interesting. I'll just maybe throw out that DeCia Retirement Research Center recently published some research about the fact that participants have a preference for safety and steady income over having a high return. And so I think sometimes we see, at least in the plan side, just by not having the tools or resources or being able to work with an advisor outside of the plan, because we know many participants will never have that opportunity. By not knowing, we have people who make sometimes poor choices because they just don't have that plan in place. And so in lieu of that, they're willing to go for the safe route or the steady income route, or what they perceive as safe, and give up higher return just because they don't know. And so I think that's what leads to that fear and anxiety, is just not knowing. So I'm sure others will approach that question a little bit differently, but that's how the plan side translates that question.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think I've thought about this before, this sort of trade-off. Hey, I could spend less now and have less variability in my income. And from, someone like me, I sort of say, well, why not live a little, deal with it if you have to. But that really is just a choice. It's just a preference. Some people might just prefer to have less variability, even if that means living on less. I don't know. Jamie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's the whole question about like what do people want and what do they say versus how they behave is such an interesting dynamic too. So I'm out at the FPA retreat, and I was talking about some of these pieces earlier today on stage, which is, we all know this adage of the, people want sustainable income through their life, right? That lifetime income source. But as soon as you mention annuity, the behaviors change just based off the word. People say they want to age in place, and you're like, hey, here's a reverse mortgage. And you're like, well, I don't want that. You're like, well, you said you wanted to age in place and have lifetime income. We've got two things that do those two things. But like there's this immediate reaction. And when you start diving into a lot of it, in my view, it's because kind of what we've taught people is like the opposite of how we then want them to behave in retirement. And that's this like, when I first thought about this, I was at the American College, and we built a little bit into RICP, and I wrote my book Rewirement and came up with that term around it. But like, I'm still super early into that. And like every week when I spend time on it, I kind of understand more and more about the behavioral side. So I'll start with like two concepts here that I think are really interesting, which is the whole like saving for retirement. So I call it SNS, saving, not spending. And like Dave Ramsey says, save your money. Everybody listens to him. They save their money. And then you get to retirement and we're just like, just kidding, you need to spend it. And we're like, you just told me for 35 years, the only thing I need to do is save more than I spend and I'll be okay. And we're like, yeah, but that was then. Like you don't work here anymore. You've got to spend your money. And we don't really teach people from a behavioral, from an emotional, from a systems perspective, anything on that side. And I got to meet Richard Thaler and had him on my show this summer. And like, we talked about that a lot, that like the nudge system that we created is mostly around the saving side. Like that's at least effectively, right? We haven't really created like a spending or decumulation, as many parameters, guardrails, right? Any of that in the system. So we just have like, we kind of lead people down a path and they get there and all the variable outcomes, like you spend all of your money day one or none of it. And we just don't have guidance for that super well. And then another part that's really interesting is that spending for people then becomes painful because we've told them that saving is good, spending is bad. And you do that for 30 years without any other change in their life. Like a lot of people, you look at the JP Morgan spending data, what you see is a lot of people with wealth like underspend what they could for retirement, that we haven't given them permission to spend. And so a big part of what advisors do, I believe for clients, especially with retirement income planning, is giving them enough confidence that they're not going to run out of money so they can actually spend and have a decent life, that we don't self-insure every risk and every concern and hold on to everything. So that's why being able to show, right, guardrails and volatility and variability over time to somebody so they can visualize it is super healthy, I think, to giving somebody that piece. And I also use this term, return on sleep, ROS, that like they can actually sleep knowing that they're not going to run out of money based off what they're spending today. So you start putting all those things together and it's really fascinating. And I'll end with this one, then maybe pass over to Johnny or something too, which is the visualization of everything is really important. I remember a speaker one time that said, anything you can explain to somebody in words, you can show in a picture. And I thought that was super powerful. And we learn better via seeing things, but most of like our industry is, it's still spreadsheets and charts and stuff like that. So I love that you guys have built in the timeline and, brought in like visuals, Great Depression and things like that to help people kind of actually visualize what might be occurring during that time period versus just us talking through things. I think we're going to get better and better at that as an industry, right? But like we're paying attention to that photo, right? Like, yeah, like every time I'm like, oh, okay, we know the experiences and the stories that start coming out of these photos. So I think that's a great way to layer that in here. But yeah, I'll pass off, I think, to Johnny, maybe. I'm sure you have a little bit you would like to add there.
Sure. As you know, Justin, this is deeply personal to me. So I'll share a little story with you guys. I left a long career in corporate America in 2018 in January. And at the time, my wife and I sat down and we seriously thought about retirement. And we thought about the possibility of taking our children back and have the experience of living in Europe, where I grew up. And so we had a financial plan built and it came back and it had a really nice probability of success. I remember to this day, it was 89%. And I've actually put some nice sort of bounce in there. So I was projecting that we're going to spend far beyond what probably reality reflected. But then we got a stress test, and the stress test said that if we would see a period like the global financial crisis from 2007 to 2009, our probability of success would have gone to 51. And I remember my wife and I looking at each other in the face saying that there's no way we can retire. I mean, that it feels like we're one bad market away from being in deep trouble. And so I guess the irony is Income Lab sort of was seated in kind of my experience around that, right? How it really made us sick to our stomach to look at a probability of success that felt like we're a coin toss away from being in deep trouble. So I think more than being good analytics, it's really about the experience here. How does our clients actually experience the data, the visualizations, to Jamie's point, that we put in front of that? And is that helping them getting more comfortable with the plan that you're developing for them? Or is it's scaring them, right? And I don't think any of us intend to have clients leave our office being more concerned when they came into our office. Justin, I'll pass it over to you.
I have done that before though, Johnny, where I've used scare tactics on people. So it's in my estate planning world, when I first started, I would tell terrible stories of families fighting over money because, sometimes, the fear is an action item too, right? And it's like, hey, you don't want that. But usually probably with our money, we don't want them leaving more fearful.
Yeah, and just a note on the visual, I believe that this is literally Al Capone's soup kitchen there. So, Yeah, Johnny, I mean, I think that's, there is a thing about this, which is just that it tells the other half of the story. Which is, you can run a plan from, 07 to the beginning of 09, and things are gonna look, they're gonna look really bad. But in a way, if you see a stress test that says, oh, we'll hit it with, the global financial crisis, and then we'll run another Monte Carlo. I was like, well, hang on, we actually know what happened after. So it is helpful to show, yeah, I mean, there was pain, right? But then a very, very long recovery after. So we don't have to guess what people would have done. Now, could the future be worse than the past? Sure. But the past is really, it's the only real data we have. So it's really helpful to actually show people what real experiences would have looked like. And honestly, if the future is worse than the past, well, you'll still want to adjust, right? I mean, the adjustment is really still the right way to approach uncertainty. Yeah, I think I don't know if Jamie or Bonnie, if you kind of have looked at tools that involve stress testing before, or given what you've seen of this, kind of thoughts on where you could imagine this being most useful to actually use stress testing. Maybe even if you've seen other types of stress tests be effective, maybe it's a portfolio stress test or things like that. I think a lot of people on this webinar are, we're always looking for very practical, experiences and ways to use tools. So maybe we'll flip it around and start with Jamie this time.
Yeah, I'll add two thoughts here. One is being clear. I think whenever you're communicating with people about like what you're actually stress testing, because Justin, you kind of hinted at that. There are actually stress tests for lots of different things out there in the world. And it's kind of one of the sales tactics that's been used in this industry for a long time, which, I'm not putting any shame on it. It's totally fine. But you'll see somebody, hey, we stress tested your portfolio and it failed in our thing. It's like, well, what were you testing it for? What was it tested for before? So Wade Pfau, who I imagine most people here know, when he was at American College with me, we did like 8 different stress tests on retirement income portfolios, but they were all for different things. So it's like, what was the volatility of your spending? What was your average ending value? What was the average return, and you could test all these different things. And what you would find out though, is that the same portfolio might do really well in one stress test and really poor in another stress test, right? So ultimately, if the client's goal is to maximize total ending value, it's a different test that you're trying to maximize, right? If their goal is to keep income between some spending level for retirement, that's the stress test then you want to run. And so to me, it's what are you trying to show? What are you trying to elicit in that client conversation? And not just use it as a be all for everything, but being super clear in your communication that, we're testing where your income might fall during these time periods versus total returns, total ending value, total estate value. Some of those things you actually would test in a different way, but what is the client's main outcome? What's their main objective? What are they worried about? And then if it's on this side where it's around the income, that's why this is super useful, which I do think, right, anecdotally, from my world, we have 46,000 households now. This is the number one concern, right? Ultimately, middle America is concerned about the retirement income. Now, some of our high net worth clients, it might be a concern, but, like I was me prepping an advisor for a meeting that they're having today with the CEO of a public company. His concern is not his retirement income, right? His concern is legacy, risk, stock options, taxes, stuff like that. So you'd want to test it in a different manner. But yeah, I think that's kind of where I see Bonnie.
I would just echo, Jamie, some of your points around, who is this concern really targeting? And I think, again, approaching it from my perspective, which is really in the retirement plan side, if we look at it today, we have, around 9 trillion in DC plan assets and around around 11 trillion in IRAs. And so we think about in the plan side, so much money has been put into these qualified plans. And when we think about it, we have, for a lot of Americans and kind of that middle America segment, the retirement plan is where they've built up all these assets. And for many of these folks, they don't have typically access during their working years to a wealth management advisor. And so it's how can we start to use some of these, these tests or these stress tests. And I think, as Jamie said, how can we really be clear about what we are communicating to show them, here is where you've done a really good job of saving, or you started to save, but here's where you can actually be in the decumulation side. And what does that start to look like in the decumulation side? That's where the in-plan solutions, or like the record keeping tools and resources that are available to most of the savers, they're woefully inadequate. And so it is, there's not a lot of opportunity to help folks really understand what that looks like in the decumulation side. And I think there's a really good opportunity to target kind of those middle income households with these types of resources in a really efficient and cost-effective way.
Bonnie, I know probably to Jamie's point about like how we've taught people to think in the saving years. In the plan world, it's really hard not to pay attention to your portfolio balance as like the core measure. And I just want that number to be high. That's why so often if you ask somebody what their legacy goal is, it'll just be whatever their balance is today. What has happened in the plan world? I know there was some talk about kind of trying to give people a better feel for, okay, but what kind of life can you actually live? Because one thing we've done here, to Jamie's point about what are we stress testing? We're stress testing standard of living, really. I mean, that's what you're talking about here. So like, can you adjust your spend, and what does that have a big effect on your standard of living or not? Maybe you've got a lot of cushion already and you could just, I don't know, go to the brew pub instead of the steakhouse. Has there been motion on that side and the plan side to help people understand how much they can spend?
Yeah, great question. I think it's such a terrible debate on the plan side with really inadequate resources. Not to sound like the pessimist, but again, I think what people are looking at is this like number that they're trying to achieve, and what is that right number that they're seeking. And I think, Justin, to your point, it's what is this big number that we're trying to achieve? And for a long time, it's like, well, if I've got $1 million, I'm set, because if I just reach that number. And one of the things that we've seen, and if we go from kind of the pendulum swing from the DB side to the DC side, and now it's starting to swing back to the middle, mostly because of, I think, regulators and legislators who are recognizing we've got to do something to help participants, right? And what I mean by that is, with DB plans going away, and then we really put participants on their own in the DC side, where we said, hey, we're going to help you accumulate all these assets. We're going to do that with things like, Richard Thaler and the nudge theory of, will help you accumulate through auto enroll and auto escalate, but then you're just going to get to that big number, and we're not going to help you with what to do with that at all. Now we're starting to swing back a little bit more to the middle, where we've got regulators and legislators with certain regulations, and Secure 1 and Secure 2.0, where we've got this push towards things like putting disclosures on participant statements that came out of a 2013 proposed reg, and now a final reg that came from Secure 1. But it's this idea of, how do we start to show participants what this account balance is going to look like as it actually translates into your retirement. Now, I think, again, it's somewhat inadequate to just put that on a participant statement as, here's what this actually translates to in your retirement, but that's kind of one of the nudges coming from the government. I think much better are certain tools like what you're producing, in this sort of resource. And I think that can be a much better way of helping participants to see the different stress tests and that sort of thing. But the government's trying to make that push in plan for those who don't have that available out of plan to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're right. I mean, when you're talking about standard of living, I mean, balances matter. But, depending on who you are, what resources you have, is it Social Security as a loan? Do you have a pension maybe? People might have rental properties, the timing of things, how you spend it. There's so much that goes into it. And really, if I can live my life, I'm not really sure I care who's writing me the check. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Johnny, I know we kind of started out this conversation with this sort of giving people permission. Bonnie, you mentioned kind of giving people permission to retire, which from a sponsor standpoint is huge. Giving people permission to live, their life in retirement and spend some money. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I know we've had some feedback from advisors who've already had a chance to use the retirement stress test, and some, anecdotes about that being an effective way to help people kind of shift their thinking. So if you want to share some of those.
Yeah, I guess I'll start out with sharing with everyone that we take feedback and stories, good and bad, with your clients very serious, and love to get more of them. So please share them with us. But one story that is very recent comes to mind. We did receive an email from an advisor sharing with us that he's been working with a couple for the better part of 3 years. And this particular couple wanted to retire, but every single time they were about to pull the trigger, they would freak out. They just couldn't get themselves to that point mentally. And even though their financial situation clearly did call for retirement if they wanted to, it was too scary for them. And it was so powerful that when we used, or this particular advisor used retirement stress test, he was one of the beta users, said that this literally he could see the stress in the room just came down. And so like, oh, it's not a pass-fail conversation. It's a conversation about minor adjustments. And so we've had many stories like that. To that point, I also saw some research that I highly recommend people look into. So David Blanchett just did some research going, I think, more sort of into your part of the business, into retirement plan participants. I think he surveyed 1,500 of them between the ages of 50 and 70. And what he found was people are much more willing to adjust than we tend to believe. He actually found that 85% of the participants found that an adjustment up to 20% was really a non-event. And what we see in the vast majority of these stress tests is you never get close to 20%, right? So I think we can provide a lot of confidence to our clients by understanding that it should never be a pass-fail sort of conversation. And again, the more stories we see like that, please share that with us. I mean, we enjoy it, but I think it's good to share with the community.
Yeah, I think that's another key point is, I know Derek Tharp, who could not join us today. He's a little new baby at home and wasn't able to pull it off. But I know he did some research with Michael Kitces on framing of retirement income plans. And I think sometimes I've heard from advisors who say, I'm not sure my clients want to adjust. So is showing them adjustments, is that going to scare them? Will it kind of mean, oh, I gave you bad advice to begin with. And what Derek and Michael found was it's quite the opposite. Setting things up to be an adjustment conversation from the beginning. It's very intuitive because people have already lived that way through their working years. So when they've gotten raises or, lost a job or something, they've adjusted spending. So it's really not a foreign concept to them. But what Derek and Michael found was that the advisor credibility was much higher, having set the stage that, hey, there will, we plan with adjustments. And then if they came to them with another, a year later, things had gotten worse and it was time for an adjustment, it was a much different conversation if they had already set it up where adjustments would be part of the plan versus coming and saying, well, your score of 90 went to 60. I think of it as, you gave somebody an A- on their final exam, and the next year you come back and say, hey, I graded it again and it's a D now, right? That doesn't make any sense to people. So I think the framing and the evidence is that actually clients are willing to think in terms of adjustments. And like Johnny said, to a surprising level, retirees or people in their later career feel that they actually could adjust on the downside, maybe more than we would think. The other thing we sometimes see, I know I've focused almost exclusively on the downside because that is what stress testing is primarily for, but it can also help you, if you switch to, during, well, then you're watching a recovery, right? So, you could, maybe you're during the Great Depression, so you've already experienced. So in the future, if there are positions where, you want to say, hey, we just took a huge hit, there are ways to kind of show people reality of how markets kind of go up and down, that, it's not always, as grim as we might think. Okay, so I think I want to, we'll just take a couple of questions before we.
You do have two good questions in there right now, Justin.
All right, so Brian, thank you for your question. So during the financial crisis, when income decreases, how do they know when they can start taking out more income again? Do guardrails reset or stay the same, and the portfolio balance has to go over the bottom guardrail again? That is a really, really good way to ask that question. So I think what's important to understand is guardrails always have to be specific and unique to the planet itself. And so when we, like, the guardrails in a way should not stay the same. Probably the best way to view this would be, imagine you set off on your journey, and these are your guardrails, and 10 years later, if they were the same, that would be strange, because now we're 10 years older, our plan should be shorter, and so on. So the guardrails are always adjusting to whatever has happened, including any change in your income. So the guardrails, now here you don't see it maybe as here, the upward is maybe a little bit more obvious here. So once they've gotten a pay raise, in the future, you see that the green line jumps up, right? Because it's giving you want some time for momentum to build up. You don't want to be telling your client every month, I'm going to send you $5 more this month. So the guardrails change. So in this example, they hit their lower guardrail. They got a pay cut. We can see above it was $400. And then we are just waiting for the blue line, the portfolio balance, to hit that upper guardrail. You can see again in the 2010s, it actually got pretty close again. And it bounced around. It took a really long time, but we're always just waiting for it to get to the upper guardrail again. So another way to say this would be, your balance is never going to be below your lower guardrail. It's the lower guardrail will readjust and say, hey, if things get bad again, I'll get another pay cut. I think I can probably find you one in stagflation. So here we go, where it just bounces along and does hit again. So this is another also a great place to show people that, yeah, I mean, things could be bad enough that there would be multiple pay cuts, right? So it's not sort of one change in income is the only thing we'll ever have to do. Any thoughts on that from the panel as well?
No, it's a good point. And I think you hit the bottom end one, but it's the same on the top, right? Like you will always bounce between the guardrails. Anytime you hit the top or bottom, it will reset, right? That's when you'll get the pay increases or pay decreases kind of based in this modeling.
That's exactly right. You can actually, in the software, you can set an income ceiling. So we've sometimes had people say, hang on a second, and here, stagflation is also good if I start during or maybe even after. Okay, so yeah, if I start in 1982, I mean, it's just like the best time you could possibly have retired in history. It would have felt terrible at the time. You didn't know it was going to be great, but it was. Okay, so my plan.
It's going to be great. Just trust me.
So these folks were planning to spend $12,700 a month, and if they had followed this plan, they would have been spending $46,300. Now that's in original dollars, right? So it actually would have been much more given inflation. So the question is just, well, is that reasonable? Would they really have increased their lifestyle by so much? Probably not. So you can put a ceiling that says, hey, yeah, I'll increase my income. That would be great. I'll increase my spending, but maybe no more than 50% or no more than double, or decide. And in that case, you would actually see this blue line go into the green. And then you could almost imagine like the difference between the green and the blue. That's just like your slush fund. You can just spend that anytime you want, and you'd still be between the guardrails. Okay, is Income Lab planning to release the raw data behind these scenarios? More normal, less bad. So we are, there are some, as software developers, we can't help always wanting to make things better. So we've taken input from people, and there definitely are some additions to the stress test that we do plan, including you being able to choose the start date. So we have 15 right now, but maybe, you want to start it when, I don't know, in your birth month or something, just see how it went. You'll be able to do that. The other is to be able to compare directly these scenarios. So, I was saying, if you compare, something with lower income to something with higher income, or a high equity to a low equity, you'll see differences. So we're working on some ways to really allow you to directly compare that, to compare those. Will Income Lab ever start analyzing investments inside the portfolios as opposed to assigning a portfolio allocation? Yeah, this is I think Bonnie and Jamie, you might have some thoughts on this as well. For really any financial planning software that deals with investments, this is a place where I think there are always challenges. There for two reasons. One is you're making generally you're doing some kind of simulation of the future, right? And so you need a way to do that, to make assumptions. And the easiest way to do that and the cleanest is to use asset allocation rather than thicker symbols or things like that. The other is we do a lot of history, and it's going to be really hard for me to show you what Tesla did in 1970. And so I think those two restrictions generally have meant kind of longer term planning has had to focus on asset kind of classes instead of particular assets. And I mean, personally, I'm comfortable with that. I don't know, Jamie, if you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, so this is something that people actually bounce around a lot with. So I'll use like eMoney and Money Guy Pro 2, right? You can put in your own investment assumptions running forward, or use like historical ones. And I have at Carson, we have bounced between those for a long period of time, because it's just a very challenging, even when you have your own data, you have your own models like we do. We can input our models then with our capital market assumptions, or do you just use like default historical ones? I don't know that there's a great answer one way or another there, but to your point, like it's actually just a really challenging piece of kind of the data set world to deal with. And then interestingly enough, if you really, there's kind of this other balance of like, are you still just being a different way of inaccurate? Like they're both going to be inaccurate, right? Is it just a different way to be inaccurate? And is it worth like the squeeze? Is it worth all the work that it takes to do that? I'll use this example. It's like we run into firms all the time when we're acquiring places or partnering, and they say, hey, we have this model. But we don't always necessarily know, like, do they have trading fees associated with it because they're not super large at the custodian? Do they have XYZ cost built into it? And so something that might look like a very similar, fund or ETF actually could have varying share classes, varying trading fees, and end up with like decently different performance, even though you're looking at the same thing. So that's often a lot of the arguments, like just go back to a general asset class view versus the underlying portfolios in each account. Now, when you can get an individual and start working with them, you can get a little deeper into that. But from like global company tech offerings, that's been a challenge for like any player really in this planning space.
Yeah, and I think typically, even if you have a user experience where you're putting in holdings, what they're really doing is mapping those to asset classes, right? So it's not that they're matching it necessarily to, again, I'll keep using Tesla. It's not like they're saying, oh, well, our projection on Tesla growth and standard deviation is this. No, it's just mapping it to a particular asset class. So, I mean, I think I agree with Jamie. It's just a challenge that there will probably always exist, and there are trade-offs.
Yeah, and I think just the other point I made is I don't know that anyone's shown that that's any more accurate performative wise long term, right? And I think if anybody ever proves that out, then maybe, but that's almost more saying that we've been able to predict how things will occur in the future better than historical, which basically we haven't been able to prove out in the investment world, right? Like we're not predictive of the future yet. So it's a great question, but I think it's a little bit of where you start going down that route on.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, maybe I'll close on this since we're kind of coming to the end of our time. I think that's a kind of a really good point. This kind of long-term planning, it requires that you make some assumptions. And I think sometimes people will ask with historical stress testing like this, well, is this all that useful? I think like Jamie said, that the evidence is really that history is sort of the when you compare it to some other options, it tends to perform better. That doesn't mean it performs really, really well. It just means it performs better than the others. So I think one thing that, like Derek and I just put out an article about producing capital market assumptions and what's a good way to do that. And we did find like using history is better, regime-based, so having multiple periods in your capital market assumptions so that you can allow things to be bad and then good and things like that. Those are better. But I think the key finding was they all have errors. And so the adjustments, like keeping up and learning from what's happened between when you started the plan and now, and making, sort of, I'll take 1982 as a good example. You would have thought things were really terrible, but as time went on, you learned that you were living through a good period where returns were really good, inflation was coming down, bonds were going up. And so as you learned that you were in a good period, you would have been able to make adjustments. So yeah, you wouldn't have started spending, huge amounts because you would have been concerned, but you would have learned over time. And so I think the adjustment piece of this, it's kind of the superpower of retirement planning, because these plans play out over decades. As an advisor, like it's okay. No one is going to pick exactly the right number. This is what I know you'll be able to spend. So having guardrails in place and allowing people to adjust is kind of the key to getting as much out of, or letting people live their best retirement. Like we're not going to get it right from the very beginning, but if you keep up and make adjustments, you can at least hope to adjust in the right direction. So with that, I think we'll close up. If anybody's interested, has questions on the stress test, a couple of great ones that we got already, please let us know. And yeah, Jamie, Bonnie, are there places that people, if they're interested in hearing more about your work? Jamie, you mentioned a show that you had Richard Thaler on.
Yeah, so we could I'll try to give so that you probably have everybody's email after this. So we did a 10-part retirement income series this summer, which was super fun. So that's where Richard Thaler, Bonnie's on that, Ed Slott, Wade Pfau. So a lot of the known researchers in this space came on that one. That one was really fun to do. So we can actually share that out, but that's on, pretty much every podcast area. That's called Framework. I don't always do retirement income planning on that. And then CarsonGroup.com is our company's one. And Bonnie, over to you.
Yeah, and thanks again for having me. I do a variety of things, including talking about in-plan retirement income solutions, and you can learn more at endeavor-retirement.com. So looking forward to seeing more of your work, Justin and team, in the plan space.
Thank you so much. Jamie Hopkins, Brian Treco, thank you so much for being here. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Take care.